When the margins move, the center trembles. For decades, the Iranian regime has relied on a familiar strategy to maintain control: isolate unrest, divide opposition groups, and suppress resistance before it can connect across regions and identities. This approach has worked largely because protests were often localized, confined to cities, social classes, or ethnic communities that could be contained without threatening the system as a whole. What makes the current moment fundamentally different is not just the scale of unrest, but the growing convergence of forces once kept apart. Among the most significant of these shifts is the visible alignment between Iranian Kurdish communities and nationwide protest movements. When historically marginalized regions begin moving in sync with national unrest, regimes enter dangerous territory. Peripheral regions are often the first to feel state pressure and the last to receive state benefits. As a result, they also tend to be the first to recognize when a system is no longer reformable. In Iran, Kurdish regions have long existed in a state of political tension, subject to heavier security presence, economic neglect, and cultural repression. That tension has never disappeared. It has merely waited. Iranian Kurds make up a significant population concentrated primarily in western provinces, such as Kurdistan, Kermanshah, and parts of West Azerbaijan and Ilam. These regions have experienced repeated cycles of unrest since the founding of the Islamic Republic. The regime has traditionally framed Kurdish dissent as separatism, using that narrative to justify militarized responses. But the current wave of protests does not fit neatly into that category. What is unfolding now is not a separatist uprising. It is something far more destabilizing: cross-ethnic solidarity. Kurdish protesters are no longer acting in isolation or advancing exclusively regional demands. Instead, they are aligning their grievances with those voiced in Tehran, Isfahan, Mashhad, and dozens of other cities. Economic collapse, political repression, lack of opportunity, and the absence of accountability have created a shared national language of dissent. When Kurdish slogans echo those heard in the capital, the regime loses its ability to divide opposition along ethnic lines. This alignment strikes at the heart of the regime's internal security doctrine. The Islamic Republic has always feared coordination more than resistance. A single protest can be crushed. Multiple protests can be managed. But synchronized unrest across diverse regions overwhelms security planning, strains manpower, and exposes the limits of control. The Kurdish participation also carries symbolic weight. Kurdish communities have long been portrayed by state media as others, disconnected from the Iranian national narrative. Their visible presence within a nationwide movement reframes the protests as truly national. This matters not just domestically, but psychologically. It challenges the regime's claim that unrest is driven by narrow interests or foreign manipulation. The response from the state has been revealing. Security operations in Kurdish regions have intensified, often exceeding the force used elsewhere. Heavier deployments, mass arrests, internet blackouts, and military-style tactics signal more than confidence. They signal fear. Authoritarian systems do not overreact where they feel secure. They overreact where they sense vulnerability. Yet, repression in Kurdish areas has not produced the desired effect. Instead of isolating dissent, it has drawn attention to it. Images, testimonies, and reports from these regions circulate rapidly, reinforcing perceptions that the state is losing control. Each crackdown deepens resentment and strengthens resolve, not only among Kurds, but among other Iranians who recognize familiar patterns of abuse. Another critical factor is organization. Kurdish civil society, despite decades of pressure, retains strong community networks. Labor groups, teachers' associations, local activists, and political organizations have experience operating under repression. This does not mean they control the protest movement, but it does mean they know how to sustain pressure. Experience matters in prolonged unrest. At the same time, most Kurdish activists are acutely aware of the dangers of militarization. They understand that open-armed conflict would give the regime justification for overwhelming force and international silence. As a result, the dominant strategy has remained civil resistance: strikes, demonstrations, symbolic acts, and coordination with broader protest calls. This strategic restraint frustrates the regime, which is far better equipped to fight armed groups than to counter mass non-cooperation. The Iranian state has historically depended on the assumption that minority regions could be sacrificed to preserve control over the center. What happens when the margins no longer accept that role? When they refuse to be isolated examples and instead become amplifiers of national dissent? That question now haunts Tehran. The involvement of Iranian Kurds also complicates the calculations of the security forces. The IRGC and allied units are stretched across multiple fronts: urban centers, border regions, and critical infrastructure. Kurdish areas, many of them mountainous and difficult to police, require disproportionate resources to control. As unrest spreads, the cost of maintaining dominance rises sharply. More importantly, the narrative of inevitability begins to crack. Regimes survive not just through force, but through belief. belief among elites that the system will endure, belief among enforcers that obedience is rewarded, and belief among the population that resistance is futile. Kurdish participation challenges all three. For elites, it signals that unrest is not confined or containable. For security forces, it increases operational strain. For the public, it demonstrates that resistance is shared. This convergence does not mean the regime is defeated. The state still possesses overwhelming coercive power. But history shows that regimes rarely fall because they are weak. They fall because they miscalculate. They underestimate how quickly solidarity can spread, how exhaustion erodes discipline, and how legitimacy collapses once enough people stop believing. The regime's greatest fear is not Kurdish protest alone. It is Kurdish protest combined with nationwide defiance, labor strikes, student movements, and elite uncertainty. That combination transforms unrest from a security problem into an existential one. As Kurdish cities echo the chants of Tehran, and Tehran responds with chants of solidarity, the old strategy of divide and suppress begins to fail. The regime can still respond with force, but force now produces diminishing returns. Each act of repression reinforces the perception that the state governs through fear alone. Part 1 of this story is about convergence, about how historically separate lines of resistance are beginning to intersect, about how the margins of power are moving inward, and about how regimes often begin to lose control, not when they face a single enemy, but when many voices start speaking the same language. What comes next will depend on whether this alignment deepens, or fractures under pressure, from regional grievance to national momentum. When Kurdish communities align with nationwide protest movements, the significance goes far beyond numbers on the street. It alters the structure of resistance itself. What once appeared as scattered expressions of anger begins to resemble momentum, and momentum is what authoritarian systems fear most. Iran is now confronting a situation where unrest is no longer compartmentalized by geography or identity. Instead, it is being woven into a shared national narrative of rejection. For years, the Iranian regime managed dissent by isolating it. Labor protests were framed as economic misunderstandings. Student demonstrations were dismissed as youthful excess. Ethnic unrest was portrayed as separatist agitation. Each category was addressed separately, using tailored repression and propaganda. The genius of this strategy lay in preventing coordination. The danger now is that coordination is happening organically. Kurdish participation accelerates this process because Kurdish regions occupy a strategic position, geographically, politically, and symbolically. These regions sit along Iran's western frontier, linking internal unrest to regional dynamics. But more importantly, they represent a population that has little remaining faith in reform from within the system. When such communities engage in nationwide protests, they do so with a long memory of broken promises. This historical memory gives Kurdish participation a different tone. The demands are not incremental, they are existential. This radical clarity influences the broader movement by shifting expectations. Protesters elsewhere begin to ask not what can be fixed, but what must be replaced. That shift in mindset marks a turning point in any protest cycle. At the same time, Kurdish activists have shown an acute awareness of the regime's playbook. They understand how quickly narratives of security threats are deployed to justify violence. As a result, much of the Kurdish engagement remains deliberately framed within civil resistance. This frustrates Tehran's security planners. The regime is well equipped to fight insurgencies. It is far less capable of managing nationwide non-cooperation. These forms of resistance are slower, but they are also harder to extinguish. Kurdish involvement has encouraged other marginalized groups to assert themselves more openly. The psychological barrier of isolation begins to dissolve. Once that barrier falls, protest movements enter a new phase. The regime can no longer credibly argue that unrest reflects narrow agendas. The narrative shifts from troublemakers to a nation in revolt. This narrative shift matters more than raw numbers because it influences undecided segments of society, including parts of the bureaucracy, business class, and even security forces. Elite hesitation is the silent accelerant of collapse. Kurdish participation sends a signal that the system's periphery is no longer containable. That signal echoes in boardrooms, ministries, and military offices far from the protest lines. The state's response reveals its anxiety. The strain becomes especially visible when protests coincide with labor actions. Another factor complicating Tehran's response is international attention. Kurdish regions have long attracted scrutiny due to their cross-border connections and diaspora networks. While international pressure alone rarely topples regimes, it narrows their room for maneuver. It limits options. It raises costs. The Iranian leadership must now balance repression with optics. Excessive force risks further isolation. Insufficient force risks emboldening protesters. This dilemma often produces inconsistent responses. Crackdowns in one region, restraint in another, creating openings for protest movements to adapt and expand. Inside the protest movement, Kurdish participation contributes organizational experience. Decades of activism under pressure have produced resilient networks capable of surviving arrests and disruptions. These networks are not hierarchical, which makes them difficult to dismantle. They also emphasize collective action over individual leadership, reducing vulnerability to decapitation strategies. This model spreads. Other protest groups adopt similar tactics. Coordination becomes horizontal rather than vertical. The movement becomes harder to map and therefore harder to stop. However, convergence also introduces risks. Diverse movements bring diverse priorities. Maintaining unity requires restraint and communication. The regime understands this and will attempt to exploit differences, reviving ethnic fears, spreading disinformation, and provoking clashes. Whether the movement can resist these tactics will shape what comes next. So far, the emphasis on shared grievances has held. Economic hardship, political exclusion, and repression cut across identity lines. Kurdish protesters articulate these themes in ways that resonate nationally. This shared language is the glue holding convergence together. The Iranian state has always depended on fragmentation to survive. Fragmentation of society, fragmentation of opposition, fragmentation of hope. Kurdish alignment threatens that model directly. It transforms resistance from a series of sparks into a spreading fire. Yet it would be a mistake to assume inevitability. Momentum can stall. Fear can return. Repression can succeed temporarily. The regime still controls the instruments of force. But what it has lost, perhaps irreversibly, is narrative dominance. It no longer defines what protests mean. Protesters do. Part 2 of this story is about momentum and meaning, about how participation from historically marginalized communities changes the scale and direction of unrest, about how convergence transforms isolated anger into national challenge. Whether this momentum leads to systemic change remains uncertain. What is certain is that the old strategy of isolation is failing. The margins are no longer quiet. They are speaking, and they are being heard. The regime's dilemma: suppress, split, or survive. As Kurdish participation deepens and national protests continue to converge, Iran's leadership faces a dilemma with no clean solution. Every option available to the regime carries risk, and every delay compounds pressure. This is the stage at which authoritarian systems often begin making contradictory decisions, tightening control in one area while loosening it in another, projecting confidence publicly while scrambling privately. Iran has entered that stage. The core problem for Tehran is not that protests exist. The Islamic Republic has survived protest before. The problem is that the logic of control no longer works as it once did. Repression still intimidates, but it no longer convinces. Propaganda still circulates, but it no longer persuades. Institutions still function, but they no longer command trust. Kurdish participation exposes these weaknesses because it undermines the regime's most effective tactic: divide and rule. For decades, the state portrayed unrest in Kurdish regions as an ethnic security issue rather than a political one. This framing allowed Tehran to deploy overwhelming force with minimal backlash from the broader population. Today, that framing is collapsing. When Kurdish cities protest alongside Tehran, Shiraz, and Tabriz, repression in Kurdish areas is no longer seen as containment. It is seen as a preview of what awaits everyone. This perception changes behavior. Security forces must now consider how their actions are interpreted nationally, not just locally. Each violent crackdown risks triggering solidarity protests elsewhere. Each arrest risks sparking strikes in unrelated sectors. The regime is forced to think defensively rather than proactively, reacting to events instead of shaping them. This is where miscalculation becomes likely. Authoritarian regimes tend to overestimate the effectiveness of force at precisely the moment when its effectiveness begins to decline. Iran's leadership may believe that harsher measures will restore order, but history suggests the opposite. Beyond a certain point, repression accelerates resistance by stripping away any remaining illusions of legitimacy. The Kurdish regions present a particular challenge because they combine 3 destabilizing factors: strong community networks, geographic complexity, and political memory. Tight-knit communities resist infiltration. Long memories of repression reduce the credibility of state promises. These factors make Kurdish areas difficult to pacify even in stable times, let alone during nationwide unrest. To compensate, the regime leans heavily on intelligence operations. Surveillance intensifies, informant networks expand. Digital monitoring grows more aggressive, yet intelligence saturation carries its own costs. It breeds paranoia within the system. Loyalty tests multiply, decision-making slows. When everyone watches everyone else, coordination suffers. This internal strain is already visible in the regime's messaging. Officials oscillate between denial and alarm, between dismissing protests as insignificant and warning of existential threats. Such contradictions signal uncertainty at the top. They also embolden protesters, who recognize inconsistency as weakness. The Kurdish role in this phase is not defined by leadership, but by persistence. Kurdish activists are not claiming to lead the national movement. Instead, they are reinforcing it, keeping pressure constant, sustaining visibility, and refusing isolation. This quiet persistence is more dangerous to the regime than dramatic escalation because it denies the state a decisive confrontation. Decisive confrontations favor the state. Prolonged ambiguity favors society. At the same time, the regime attempts to split the movement from within. Disinformation campaigns target ethnic fears, suggesting that Kurdish participation will lead to fragmentation or foreign intervention. The goal is to revive suspicion and break solidarity. Whether this strategy succeeds depends on how effectively protesters maintain a shared narrative. So far, that narrative remains focused on common grievances rather than identity-based demands. This is a strategic advantage. It keeps the movement inclusive and limits the regime's ability to isolate groups. However, maintaining this focus requires discipline. Internal disputes, if amplified, could fracture momentum. Another risk lies in escalation dynamics. As protests persist, some voices may call for more confrontational tactics. The regime understands this and may attempt to provoke escalation deliberately, hoping to justify overwhelming force. Kurdish regions, with their history of armed resistance, are especially vulnerable to such provocation. This makes restraint both a moral and strategic choice. Nonviolent resistance does not guarantee success, but it maximizes legitimacy and broad participation. It also complicates repression by forcing the regime to justify violence against largely peaceful actions. Kurdish activists appear acutely aware of this balance. International dynamics further complicate the regime's calculations. Kurdish participation attracts external attention due to cross-border connections and historical sensitivities. Tehran fears that unrest in Kurdish regions could invite foreign involvement, diplomatic, economic, or otherwise. Even the perception of such risk influences decision-making, often leading to heavier-handed responses that backfire. The Iranian leadership must also consider the loyalty of the IRGC and other security forces. While top commanders remain aligned with the regime, prolonged deployment against civilians carries psychological and operational costs. Kurdish regions have historically been sites of intense security operations, increasing fatigue among personnel. Fatigue reduces discipline. Reduced discipline increases error. Errors create flashpoints. This is how systems unravel, not through grand confrontations, but through accumulation of small failures. Within the broader protest movement, Kurdish participation reinforces the sense that change is possible, not inevitable, but conceivable. This matters enormously. People do not need certainty to act. They need plausibility. When resistance appears plausible, participation grows. When participation grows, repression becomes harder. This feedback loop now works against the regime. Yet it is important to recognize that collapse is not guaranteed. Authoritarian systems can survive prolonged unrest through adaptation, co-optation, and selective concessions. Iran's leadership may attempt controlled reforms, reshuffles, or symbolic gestures to relieve pressure. Whether these measures succeed depends on whether society still believes in gradual change. Evidence suggests that belief is fading. Kurdish communities, having experienced decades of unfulfilled promises, are unlikely to be swayed by cosmetic adjustments. Their skepticism influences the broader movement by reinforcing the idea that structural change, not reform, is required. This shifts the conversation from policy to power. That shift marks the beginning of the end for many regimes. Part 3 reveals the regime's central dilemma. Suppressing protests risks national backlash, tolerating them risks normalization, dividing them risks exposure. There is no safe path forward, only choices between bad and worse. As Kurdish participation continues, it magnifies every contradiction within the system. It stretches security capacity, undermines propaganda, and challenges elite confidence. It does not defeat the regime alone, but it pushes the system closer to a point where outcomes become unpredictable. And unpredictability is the enemy of authoritarian control. The next phase will test whether convergence can withstand pressure, whether restraint can outlast provocation, and whether the regime can adapt faster than society mobilizes. History suggests that when the margins move together with the center, the balance of power begins to shift, even if the final outcome remains uncertain. The moment of decision and the shape of what comes. Next, every long political struggle eventually reaches a moment where momentum demands resolution. Not because events slow down, but because the old order can no longer function as it once did. Iran is now approaching such a moment. The convergence of nationwide protests with sustained participation from Kurdish regions has pushed the Islamic Republic into a phase where survival depends not on strength, but on choice. The regime still exists. Its institutions still operate. Its security forces still deploy. But existence is not the same as stability. Stability requires legitimacy, predictability, and belief, 3 elements that have eroded beyond easy repair. The involvement of Iranian Kurds has accelerated this erosion by removing one of the regime Airways' most reliable defenses, fragmentation. For decades, Tehran ruled by managing differences. Ethnic groups were isolated, economic classes were divided, political grievances were compartmentalized. This structure allowed the state to apply pressure selectively, preventing opposition from forming a unified front. That structure is now breaking down. What Kurdish participation has done, perhaps more than any single factor, is normalize national solidarity. It has shown that dissent is not confined to one identity or region. It has demonstrated that resistance does not have to choose between local and national goals. This normalization changes expectations. People no longer ask whether protest is justified. They ask whether silence is sustainable. At this stage, the regime faces three broad paths, none of them safe. The first is intensified repression. This path offers short-term control at the cost of long-term viability. It risks triggering wider strikes, international isolation, and internal fatigue within the security forces. Heavy repression may quiet the streets temporarily, but it cannot restore legitimacy. When fear becomes the only governing principle, systems grow brittle. Brittle systems eventually shatter. The second path is controlled adaptation, limited reforms, reshuffled officials, symbolic concessions. This approach aims to divide the opposition and buy time, but its effectiveness depends on trust, and trust is precisely what the regime has lost. Kurdish communities, in particular, have little reason to believe in promises of reform after decades of unmet commitments. Their skepticism spreads outward, weakening the impact of any cosmetic changes. The third path is internal transformation, an elite-driven restructuring of power that preserves order while altering the system S-form. This could involve sidelining clerical authority, empowering security institutions, or negotiating new arrangements. Such a transformation might stabilize the state temporarily, but it would not resolve underlying grievances. It would merely replace one form of authoritarianism with another. None of these paths address the core issue. The social contract between state and society has collapsed. For protesters, including Kurdish participants, the struggle is no longer about specific policies. It is about dignity, agency, and voice. These are not demands that can be met through repression or partial reform. They require a fundamentally different relationship between power and the public. This is why the regime's greatest challenge is not tactical, it is existential. As Kurdish participation continues, it reinforces a crucial lesson learned through experience. Endurance matters more than spectacle. Sustained pressure, not dramatic confrontation, is what erodes authoritarian systems. Kurdish regions have demonstrated this endurance repeatedly. Their role in the broader movement is not to dominate, but to persist, to refuse disappearance from the national conversation. This persistence influences the behavior of others. Workers consider strikes, students consider defiance, bureaucrats consider non-compliance. Even within the security forces, quiet doubts emerge. These shifts are rarely visible in real time, but they accumulate. History shows that regimes often fall not when protests peak, but when participation becomes routine, when dissent becomes a normal part of life rather than an extraordinary act. Iran appears to be moving toward that condition. At the same time, the risks ahead are real. Power vacuums invite conflict. Fragmented transitions can produce violence. External actors may attempt to influence outcomes. Kurdish regions, because of their location and history, could face disproportionate danger in any chaotic scenario. This reality informs the cautious approach taken by many Kurdish activists who understand that reckless escalation could cost civilian lives without guaranteeing success. The future, therefore, remains unwritten. Iran could enter a prolonged period of instability, with cycles of protest and repression reshaping society slowly. It could experience a sudden elite fracture that accelerates change. It could see the emergence of a new authoritarian configuration. Or it could surprise the world with a negotiated transition few expect. What is clear is that the old equilibrium is gone. The Islamic Republic can no longer rely on isolation, fear, or fragmentation to govern indefinitely. Kurdish participation has exposed the limits of those tools by demonstrating that solidarity is possible even under extreme pressure. That demonstration cannot be undone. For the regime, the question is no longer how to suppress dissent, but how to survive a society that has stopped believing. For the protesters, the question is no longer whether resistance matters, but how to sustain it without losing direction or unity. For Iran as a whole, the coming period will define a generation. History does not move in straight lines. Progress is uneven. Setbacks are inevitable. But moments of convergence, when marginalized voices align with national movements, are rare. They mark inflection points where the future becomes open again. Iran is standing at such a point. The Kurdish participation in nationwide protests does not guarantee victory. No single group can defeat a state alone. But it has altered the balance of possibility. It has shown that the margins are no longer silent, and that the center can no longer ignore them. That change alone is historic. What comes next will depend on courage, restraint, and the ability to imagine a different future. Not imposed by force, but claimed through collective will, the story is still unfolding, and the world is watching. If you found this breakdown informative and meaningful, please like this video to help it reach more people. Subscribe to the channel for in-depth geopolitical analysis, hidden history, and stories the mainstream media often ignores. Turn on notifications, because the next chapter of Iran's story could unfold at any moment. Thanks for watching.